the nation becomes the alibi for the state to control a particular territory. I think it's really, really important for people to know that the disparities in the former colonies today are greater than the disparities that existed there under colonial rule, right? And that is not a call for a return to colonial rule, but it's a call for something more and something better than nation states. If we really care about Palestinians, and if we really care about Native Hawaiians, right, and all of those other people who are currently struggling for some form of national sovereignty, I think we can best serve them by sharing with them the experiences of other people who went down that road and what it got them. That the boots don't come off the neck once you get national sovereignty, right? That the Palestinians who will rule, because, if there is ever a Palestinian nation state, Palestinians will rule it. But that doesn't mean that all Palestinians are going to be self-determinate. I honestly do not think that continuing to talk about a Palestinian sovereignty as the solution is actually going to help actual Palestinians.
Dilemma Podcast, Jay Shapiro here. I'm back from the weekend up in London where I was hosting 3 panels at the How the Light Gets In festival, really cool philosophy and music festival. For my members, I gave you a little preview of the 3 panels that I was going to host. I think the one that turned out just the best was about transhumanism. It was really, really cool. So when that one is live, whenever the organization puts that out, I'll point everyone to it. I thought that went really well. The others were good as well, but the transhumanism one was really, really fascinating. Maybe I'll invite one of them on Dilemma for a solo conversation about it. And then also for the members, reminder, if you're interested in supporting me in the channel, sign up for it. And I'm going to be doing a live stream just for the members on the last Sunday of every month, which is coming up in just a few days at noon Eastern for about an hour. We'll talk, share ideas. I'll answer questions and tell you what's on my mind. It's a way for me to thank you for supporting the channel and for me to hear from you a little bit and to get some feedback too. So on to this conversation today. It's really, really cool. And I talked to Nandita Sharma. She's a professor of sociology and a sociologist and author, really describes herself sort of as a philosopher of migration, which is such a cool thing to study. And she wrote this book called Home Rule, which I think is a rather challenging thesis that she's going to lay out in our conversation, which really takes aim at nationalism as a concept for sure, and then the very concept and construct of the nation state that I think we take for granted so much as really being this kind of false lure of a promise of freedom. And obviously in the conversation in the world right now, we didn't really plan this, but the timing worked out just sort of perfectly, that states getting up at the UN to recognize Palestine as a state really makes this conversation incredibly relevant. So we end up talking a lot about national sovereignty and nation states and the Palestinian liberation effort, amongst many others, in this concept philosophically. And I think it's a really kind of challenging conversation. It also really slots very well into my little mini series I did about anarchy, which was, I'll put them on the screen here, but conversations with Ruth Keena on sort of the history of anarchy, and then Sophie Scott Brown on more of the politics and everyday anarchy. This conversation is definitely also an anarchistic conversation and project that Nandita's putting out there. So if you haven't seen those and you want more of sort of the history and philosophy of this kind of thinking, I think it really, really relevant. So it really prepared me to have this conversation. So one of the thoughts I had during this conversation is that a lot of this feels kind of far away. You'll even see it was difficult for me even to imagine kind of other ways to talk about or pursue liberation or freedom at these scales that's kind of outside the lens of thinking in terms of nation states. It's just a really embedded concept that I do think she's right. We need to dissolve. And in doing that, I think we need to it's hard to sort of get your head there, but to think about what nationalism and nation states are in the first place. And she has these great definitions that I'm just going to put here, and she'll also walk through, of something like nationalism turns people into a people, right? and transforms land into territory. And that might seem really basic or maybe almost unavoidable, but I think it's an important thing to keep returning to for something like Nandita Sharma to be so, I think, rightfully concerned about. So like we mentioned the enclosure movements, which you could think of as a historical trend of some sort of kind of awful alchemy of ripping land away from people or from us and transforming it into territory where it sort of becomes a kind of legal entity with ownership and maybe some promises of equitable access from the rulers who will grant it to you, when before it was just simply kind of earth or land and a kind of genuine commons. And Anita is not being overly romantic to go back to something. She doesn't have some romanticized vision of history in the past of being some sort of perfect Garden of Eden, which we must return to. But I think her concepts or keeping us focused on the North Star of genuine freedom and calling the pursuit of national sovereignty as maybe sort of a false lure with its psychological benefits and attraction is a really important voice in the moment. So I'm interested in how you respond to it because she gets plenty of pushback from this kind of stuff. And so I'm going to let it get into the conversation and you'll see how it hits you. And then just a final note before the conversation that I think the things that we're going to talk about are actually quite personal. On a political level, it's actually rather, I think, controversial and a bit confronting. You'll hear some of that. But you'll hear her get emotional right away when talking about her mother. And I think it's actually quite a beautiful moment to think about these things. We're talking here in this conversation about labels like migrant, native, indigenous, colonizer, settler, etc. And what I think Nandita wants us to do is just sort of cease accepting these labels sort of without question and just allow ourselves to be humans, right? And notice how these labels have been weaponized to divide us and keep us separate, especially in her work Native and Migrant, which is a really interesting clash. And it's all just kind of killing us. And so I think her thesis and her effort is surprisingly challenging and confronting. And for some people, it will be difficult. But totally honestly, I found very little philosophically I disagreed with here, although politically I'm not sure what to do with all of it. So maybe you can help me with that or help think through some of that. But I think she's an incredible voice, really important writer. I'll be back at the end for a very brief and final thought. So enjoy my conversation with Nandita Sharma. The elephant in the room in the world of a lot of these post-colonial conversations that I have really sort of entered into is the question of nationalism. Is the question of like, well, I don't really like the concept of nationalism, but here I am waving a Palestinian flag around, and then it feels like, okay, is this sort of a means to an end? So I think we're going to get into all that kind of stuff. But I do think, in your book, right from your acknowledgments page, I think is really cool and a place to start. If you wouldn't mind sharing a bit about your personal history or identity or how you talk about that, about how you are, and maybe how that brought you to the interest in these kinds of questions.
Right. Yeah. I know that that becomes a bit emotional. So we'll see how that goes.
It's really early for you if you're going to bring out the tissues. But if you wouldn't mind, I mean, I thought it was really beautifully written, but also, I mean, because I think this subject is really personal for so many people. So if you want to save that one for later, go ahead. But I think it's interesting just to, I always ask a little bit about the personal background of everyone I'm talking to, about how they came to these questions.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that this book in part came from my effort to account for having been made into a migrant. And all of what that means, right? And primarily what that means, particularly, the category of migrant isn't just a one about nationality, right? It's also a racialized category, right? Not everyone who doesn't have a nationality of the place of the state that they live in is necessarily called a migrant. So it was really that kind of potent and horrible combination of racism and nationalism that really shaped my upbringing. and of course affected my parents in their adulthood after they had moved from India to Canada. So it was just really trying to make sense of what this category does that is so consequential to people's lives, particularly um, by harming them in so many ways, harming them in terms of their livelihoods, right? Their kind of socioeconomic status, their ability to feel safe and at home. So all of that kind of came into my interest in immigration and citizenship policies. But, also I was writing this book when my mom passed away.
Yeah.
So that seemed like an appropriate thing to do for her.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
The other thing that I might want to mention about my background that also informed this book, which I didn't mention in my acknowledgments, was, my grandparents were very active in the anti-colonial movement in
Right.
India. And I just, knowing what India is like today, what post-colonial India
Yeah.
is like, I also was trying to make sense of the huge gulf between what they fought for and what people got.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
that was also really important to me.
Yeah, that's amazing. I'm gonna peg that one because it's almost the punchline. In my preparation for this conversation, I watched one of your talks from 4 years ago where someone sort of attacked you at it. You'll probably remember the one I'm talking about. But you had a great line about sort of the anti-colonial success of something like a revolutionary India, and then you're like, and then they got fucking India, and it was a great sort of emotional punch, and it's almost the punchline. So I'm going to put a bow on that, and let's work back
Okay.
to that because it's a beautiful way
Okay.
to put sort of like this underlying inherent criticism, and I think really good one you have, important one about these post-colonial leftist movements that we have
Yeah.
that says it so perfectly. But let's back this all the way up because it's super super good. So what would you say your core thesis for someone who hasn't read the book of home rule really is? It seems to be about migrant versus native, but what do you think the core thesis is? Like, why did you really need to write the book?
The book was an intervention in the politics that normalized, accepted, valorized, continued to fight for nation states. And
Right.
so I was very interested in showing that each and every nation state comes with the category of migrant, and that is the key mechanism through which nation states create a category of people that are left outside of the system that rules this world, right? The world system of nation states. So I was interested in how that makes sense to people, how people don't see the violence that is being done, and just simply accept the categories that they've been placed into, right? So I wanted to understand the power of citizenship. I wanted to understand how the category of citizenship was narrowing to be even less, it's always been an exclusionary category because it cannot include everyone. Um, but how it was narrowing to become even more exclusive and wrapped around the category of native. So I was really interested in how the colonial category of native, which represented those who had been colonized, then came to be something to be sought after. In the anti-colonial movement, it was a category to disavow and to run away from and say, no, 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 we're not natives, we're nations. And so, how did we come full circle to we're nations, but we're native nations? And that makes us better than the people who are not native, and the quintessential unnative is the migrant.
Yeah,
So
that
I was really, so one, if I could sort of say one
sure
more
sure.
thing, is that another goal, or main argument of this book is that post-colonialism is a form of ruling, right? It's a style of government that perpetuates anti-immigrant politics,
Yeah.
and it does so through the nationalism that makes people feel like they belong somewhere, and therefore that kind of sense of belonging empowers them to be exclusionary.
Yeah, this is
I-
so good. I think your book is like surprisingly controversial, and like it seems like on first take it's sort of an academic working on these categories and whatnot, but it actually really is when you get into it. It raises hackles and people get really emotional about what you're putting out. Not even in the same way you started with a personal identity, which we could talk about, the psychological sort
Yeah,
of feeling of home.
yeah.
But these categories of migrant and indigenous and native are really huge, huge. I was surprised how controversial it was when I first started getting into your book. So I want to keep surfacing them because I think this stuff is really, really important right off the bat. So would you say it's fair to sort of put it out that the post-colonial or anti-colonial efforts, and also historically, where are you sort of pegging all of this? Are they? What mistake are they making? Is it a foundational mistake by playing the game that their enemies are creating or imposing upon them? Does that make sense? Where does this really start? I like it as a corrective. I just want to ground my audience exactly sort of what you're correcting here, wanting to correct.
Yeah, I think there's several things, and I think the first one is to associate colonialism with foreignness, right? That the problem of colonialism was that some foreigners are ruling over us. This is the nationalist version of anti-colonialism, which, I acknowledge that there were many other forms of anti-colonialism, but at the same time, we also need to acknowledge that the nationalist version certainly won out, right? So in the nationalist version of anti-colonialism, the colonizers were represented as foreigners, and that was the quintessential problem of them, that if we could rule ourselves, home rule, then everything would be fine because we obviously care about ourselves, unlike these foreigners who don't care about us. So once we obtain national sovereignty, then life will be better for people, right? Because we'll be quote unquote self-determinant, right, or self-governing. And I think that started the process of concealing what colonialism actually was, and thereby justifying what post-colonialism came to be. And what colonialism was really about was the expropriation of people from their land, the exploitation of their labor, the denigration of their character, and the lack of democracy in their lives, right? The lack of actual self-control over what happened to them and the people that they cared about. And national sovereignty did nothing to resolve that, except perhaps this kind of psychological benefit of feeling that you had won a great victory, right? And it was a great victory, pushing empires out of your lives was an incredible victory, one that, people would scarcely believe possible, right? And it happened. But that psychological victory and that sense of accomplishment and free, even ideas that we were now free did not actually translate into the material reality of people's lives. So that psychological euphoria of, the initial period of post-colonialism quickly dissipated, right? So if you read all of the early post-colonial novels from Africa, from, Asia, they're all very, very melancholy, right? They're all like these people, like, and I'm talking about the, mid 1960s already, right? So people in the novels are like really kind of like in shock that their lives are so bad when they were supposed to be so good. Like the promises made were not promises kept. And everyone was trying to come to grips with it because there was nothing else on offer, right? The nationalist anti-colonial movement offered people like this horizon to work towards and this vista of freedom and self-determination. And then it didn't happen, but there was no, there was a void in the politics. The fact that we didn't much earlier identify nationalism as a problem rather than a solution, and that we didn't identify earlier that national sovereignty does not end the practices that people really hated, right? Which was the loss of their land, the exploitation of their labor, and the denigration of themselves. Because we didn't come to that understanding much, much earlier, right? There was no political movement that could lead us into being able to deliver on what people actually fought for when they were fighting empires.
Yeah.
I think the only thing that filled that gulf was this theory and politics of neo-colonialism, which I take quite issue with, right? Because it fails to acknowledge precisely what I'm trying to argue was left unacknowledged by national sovereignty, which is global capitalism, right?
Yeah.
Like how, there was this imagination that once we throw off the yoke of the empire and we get national sovereignty, then we will be self-determinant. We will decide what happens here. And it's like, no, you won't. Even the most powerful nation states in the world don't have that kind of fantasy of national sovereignty. They're all subject to the bond markets. They're
Yeah.
all subject to capital investors and what kind of return on investment they want. And they're all subject to the power of capital. And that was what was left unsaid by
Yeah.
nationalists.
That was perfect. Yeah, I've been my audience would probably know I've been really into Kwame Nkrumah lately and reading his neocolonialism that you've now called out, and I think he saw it, right. He saw that same beast. Maybe you disagree with the word or sort of where he should have taken it. But before you get to that, because it's great, and I think in that answer you laid your cards on the table. If anyone didn't know, sort of where you find the real culprit, which is global capitalism. But the word nationalism also, you have a really fantastic, I think, abstract definition for. I'm not sure if it's yours, but it's the thing of taking people and making a people out of it. Do you mind walking through that? And maybe it's also the same with land and territory. I think it's really, really important early in this conversation to put our finger exactly what you mean by nationalism. And then I want to ask who you think is sort of forming and controlling nationalism, if it's sort of a ground up thing or if it is this kind of residue of the global capital machine you sort of just alluded to.
Yeah, so nationalism is a particular way of organizing state power, right? It is always aimed at sovereignty, right? Nationalism wouldn't make much sense if it was just like, I don't know, a social club or something,
Yeah.
right? It is always after control over territory and all life on it, right? That's nationalism is aimed at controlling territory and the people on it. And so what nationalism requires is, and what makes nation states different from the other states that preceded that form of state power, is that nation states in particular have an imagination of the nation, right? And that nation, unlike the empire, right? The nation, unlike the empire, is always a very, very narrow slice of humanity, right? Empires, both of my parents were born as subjects of the British Empire, right? And empires always have this extremely worldly ambition, right? We want the world. We want as many territories, as many people's labor that we can control, right? And they'll all be subjects, right? You've got the subjects of British India, you've got the subjects of British Jamaica, right? You've got the subjects of British Canada, on and on and on, right? We're all subjects. And of course, racism is what made that subjecthood ranked or hierarchical. But nonetheless, they had this imagination, as did all previous empires before them, the Roman Empire, on and on and on, right? So what nations do is go, okay, we don't have that. We don't imagine that everyone in the world can be part of our nation, and that would be undesirable for us. We have a nation, and we're going to define it through largely racialized means, right? Like, what is your bloodline, i.e. your genealogy, your ancestors, etc. What language do you speak? What religion do you have? Like, there's various ways you can formulate a nation, but they're generally all the same ways that you would formulate a race, right? So the nation becomes the alibi for the state to control a particular territory, right? And I say that the nation is an alibi because nation states promise its citizens that it will take care of them and protect them and be the top priority, right? We are here to serve the nation. And of course, that's complete garbage because in no nation state in the world are its citizens taken care of in the way that they imagine they are, right? And so I know I'm getting ahead of myself here, so I'll just backtrack to the territory part and how land becomes territory. And this is really important today because people today, particularly in the name of indigeneity, argue that what they're fighting for is land, right? That this is our land. And, you can see the racialization creeping in when, this is our ancestral land or whatever, right? Very nationalistic framing of land. But what nationalists mean by land is not the actual land that people need, because we all need land. Like we all need this planet to live on. Like we are very grounded in terra firma, right? And obviously also the water and the air that we need to survive. But that land gets transformed under nationalism as the land of a people, right? So they are the people of that place. And if sovereignty is gained, then that becomes the territory of that nation state, right? And the territory itself is bounded, right? The territory is also, unlike empires, not everywhere. So let me just give you a concrete example if this is too abstract, right? So when the British Empire wanted to take over what is, present day Iraq, right? They colonized it, turned the people that lived there into British subjects, and said, this territory is now part of the British Empire. When the United States invaded and occupied Iraq, they didn't say this is now part of the United States and these people are now American citizens. Quite the opposite. There's no way that people in the United States would have accepted that because they don't want to expand the United States to include Iraq, and they don't want those people to be American citizens with the same rights and entitlements that people in the US have, US citizens have. So nations, the territory that they imagine is very much connected to this people that the state claims to serve, right? And all of that, I would argue, is rubbish because it's ultimately the creation of a false sense of community around which to rally so that we don't actually see that the problem is within and without, right? It's the capitalists amongst us, and it's the capitalists out there, right?
Yeah.
And that we actually have much more in common with and have our own interests tied up with the lives of people who we're told we have nothing to do with, right? Those people who are not of our place. And that particularly lands heavily on those who are categorized as migrants, right? Because they are the quintessential people out of place.
Yeah.
So there's no nation state in the world that doesn't have migrants. None. There's no nation state in the world in which everyone who's living there is a citizen. None. It is about creating a new us and them that conceals the actual operation of power. I don't know if that is at all clear. So let me know if you want me to rephrase any of
No,
that.
it's good. I think I want you to deal with some of the challenges to it. I mean, one of the ones I've already alluded to it now. I was watching this Zoom talk you were giving. It must have been during COVID. And you were really lovely. And then this woman really came after you. I think her name was Rita, if she if she happens to find this. And she came after you with a kind of attack that I was a little surprised by. But I think what she was getting at was, if people were just following your good abstract sort of philosophical dissection of the problem there, it seems to throw some cold water on this idea and this term that is very romantic and powerful of indigenous rights and indigenousness. And I think she was responding to something maybe unfair, saying, you're demanding that indigenous people just disappear or erase themselves. I'd love for you to respond to that also here, because again, like I do think these ideas that you're laying out, although academic and abstract, are really pretty powerful, and in practice would change, if adopted, change a lot of the language and efforts that we're using. So first respond to that one, and then I have another potential challenge to your framing.
Yeah, so indigeneity is seen as, the remainder or the continuation of colonization, right? And one of the things that is interesting and odd about the period of post-colonialism is that anti-colonialism is alive and well, right? In the sense that the way that we understand what is wrong in the world is still framed through the ideas of empire and colonialism, right? So we're much more likely to say, this is colonialism or this is imperialism, rather than say, this is nationalism and this is the nation state that is the problem, right? So indigenous people are kind of by definition, and this is, there's a lot of interesting work on this. By definition, the people who can claim to be indigenous are the people who don't have national territory, who don't have national sovereignty, right? Who don't have sovereignty over the territory that they claim as national homelands, right? Those are the people who we call indigenous. So indigenous already is this kind of political term for those who are not yet nationally sovereign, but it is essentialized as the, ultimate marker of being a people of a place, which is also, I would argue, the core of national sovereignty, right? The core of nationalist notions of the relationship between people and land, right, is indigeneity. So how did that happen? One of the things that we need to pay attention to this category of indigenous is that it's a very old category, and it was initially a category of ruling, right? So when you look at the term indigenous comes from the classical Greek, and it means a person who's born inside the house. And the connotations of, classical Greek society was a slave owning, state society, right? So if you're born in the house, you are part of the master's house, right? Slaves aren't born inside the master's house. They're left outside somewhere, right? So to be indigenous was to be part of the master's house. So this, this kind of this idea of insiderness, like this is my place, both meanings of like this is the territory that I'm on, and this is my place on top, right? So things, European empires from the 1500s on, European empires also use that category of native to designate a certain people with a certain place, right? That was literally what native meant. So my parents were British subjects and they were natives of India, right? So nativeness came to territorialize people's sense of themselves, right? I am this people of this land. So nationalists took up that meaning of this people belongs to this land in order to take over that territory as its sovereigns, right? So that association of you can't really be free and there will be no justice in the world unless every people is sovereign over their place, right? Like that's kind of the foundation of the idea of indigenous rights right now, that everything will improve for those people who identify as indigenous, again, along with the post-colonial project, when you get national sovereignty, right? When you are the masters of the house, right? When you get to decide how life happens there. And of course, much of the image that we have of indigenous rights is this kind of utopia, right?
Yeah.
Where everything will be fine, right? We will, there's no discussion. We don't have to talk about capitalism because there won't be any capitalism here because these are indigenous people and they don't like that. So we have this kind of time that we put indigenous people in, which is pre-capitalist, pre-state even for some people. So there's a real kind of denial and disavowal of the actual history of the people we're talking about. So when we say indigenous rights, for many people, it's a kind of catch-all phrase to talk about this utopia that we are aiming for. But what gets left out is that we actually, particularly now compared to 500 years ago, we actually live on an incredibly interconnected, interdependent, shared planet, right? So the politics of indigenous rights or national sovereignty want to bring us back to people live in this place and it's their place. Trust us that they will be nice about it. But what I see is that in every indigenous movement, right? And I'm not talking about all indigenous people, but certainly the politics of these movements, there is already a migrant other that is not a part of the society, right? So I live in Hawaii. A very popular discourse here is about Asian settler colonialism, right? The Asians that they're referring to are descendants of plantation workers who came as indentured labor to work on plantations that were established by U.S. Capital and Hawaiian elites, right? The Hawaiian kind of kingdom, in fact, that the British established. And so these, already in Hawaii, a very popular politics of, Native Hawaiian sovereignty is already absolutely defined by this idea that there are these Asians, and not only are they Asian, whatever that means, right? Which is, I think, a bizarre way of talking about people here, but they're also settler colonists. So they are hostile to our national sovereign project. And again, I think it goes back to what I was saying earlier. Nations are always imagined as a core group of people who are, defined in racialized terms, right? So how can you have Asians who are also going to be part of this society in any other way other than being supplicant, right? Or subordinate, just as migrants are in the United States, just as migrants are in France, just as migrants are in India, right? So it's
Yeah.
not, it's presented as a wholly different project, even a utopic project that will solve all of our problems, but it's actually part and parcel of the same project that every other national sovereignty movement engages in, right? I
Yeah.
don't actually see it as fundamentally different than the American project, for example.
Yeah, that's it's quite good. I was going to challenge you with something, but I actually like what you said, and it kind of took care of it. But yeah, I think the elephant in the room that we're talking about now is Palestine. I'd like to bring it into the conversation. And you do write about Israel Palestine in the book. But to that point, when I was interviewing Elon Pape shortly after October 7th, actually, he had a great line where he was talking basically about this habit of almost the idealization of the Palestinian or whatever that's sometimes can be done on the left. And he said, like the Palestinians don't have any secret to life like any that we don't have. They just want to participate in it. They just want to deal with the same bullshit and struggles and all the stuff we're talking about now. So I'll just have you react to then the news now, because it's like, I don't know how many countries have gotten up with their leaders at this UN thing, which is predicated on this sort of sacredness of the nation state as some sort of like, almost divine thing that we have to go for and treat things as. And they're recognizing the state of Palestine, and let alone the kind of ridiculousness of like where it is and the facts on the ground and all of that. How do you read this news? Because I know there's a split. Some people celebrating, some people not. Some people sort of shrugging, being like, we want real action, etc. But there might be some people who see you shaking your head and they're like, okay, I get it. Like the nation state, this really flawed nationalist idea, but like it's a step towards some better future. You're skeptical of it. So how does this news hit you these days?
Well, I think it's utterly tragic. If we really care about Palestinians, and if we really care about Native Hawaiians, right, and all of those other people who are currently struggling for some form of national sovereignty, right, I think we can best serve them by sharing with them the experiences of other people who went down that road and what it got them, right? And as I mentioned, there is an initial euphoria after you throw off the, boots off the neck, right? Of course, you're going to feel like you can breathe more, right? And you're more in control of your life. But there is a lesson that we need to learn from the past century, right? And it's the lesson that the boots don't come off the neck once you get national sovereignty, right? That the Palestinians who will rule, because, if there is ever a Palestinian nation state, Palestinians will rule it. But that doesn't mean that all Palestinians are going to be self-determinate, right? The rulers of a Native Hawaiian sovereign state, the rulers of a Palestinian sovereign state will be no different than the rulers of any other nation state today, right? They will not be in serving the best interests of the actual people that they claim to be representing, right? I think it's really, really important for people to know that the disparities in the former colonies today are greater than the disparities that existed there under colonial rule, right? And that is not a call for a return to colonial rule, but it's a call for something more and something better than nation states, right?
Yeah.
Nation states, at the end of the day, nationalists are playing a game with us, right? And it's a total fool's game. People who are going to control our lives are telling us that they're setting us free because they share some nationality. They claim to what they claim that we are part of the same people, right? And that, of course, a people takes care of itself, right? Like this model of the nation as some kind of family, which, as a feminist, we could talk about what the family does and how equal that is. But the what is being sold to people by nationalists is that we are a family, we are a community, we will take care of each other. And what is not being told that many, millions of people around the world have learned the hard way is there is a major hierarchy in this family and there is a major hierarchy in this community. And it is class-based. It's going to be how you're gendered. It's going to be how you're sexualized. It's going to be um, how, class you belong to at the end of the day. Who's going to rule? Who rules these states? What do they
Yeah.
do? Right? So to me, to say that what will set Palestinians free, what will set Native Hawaiians free is a nation state seems to be basically saying like, okay, never mind, go ahead and make the same mistakes that everyone else has made. Uh, don't fight for something more. Don't like let's not support people for something more. Let's keep them separate from us. Like somehow my struggle is only to support the Palestinians. It's not actually to say to them, let's work together for a better world that we can all live in without rulers, right? Like, why can we not say that? Like,
Yeah.
why is that seen as disrespectful as rendering them invisible, eradicating them from our imaginations? One thing about the Gaza situation that has been really so horrifying to me is how little there were, how few calls there were for people to be able to leave Gaza
Hmm.
in the midst of the utter, bombardment and now starvation of the people there. That somehow leaving was not something that we were allowed to call for,
Yeah.
right? Calling for that would equal quote unquote ethnic cleansing, right? That somehow it's better for who, it's not clear. It seems to me that it's better for those of us who claim to be acting in solidarity with Palestinians to let them stay there and fight for a territorial sovereignty rather than actually live.
Well, people are going to hear the calls to leave Gaza is, reward. It's exactly what the Zionists want, and playing. I guess it brings up. Um, it brings up. I'm thinking of the Native Americans because I just recently, in a book I wrote, was writing about Tecumseh and the Native American cause, and the conference that they had in the face of encroaching, as they put it, sort of European colonization westward and manifest destiny. In this conference that they had, where it was like a prototype of the two-state solution, where he wanted to get all the tribes together and literally, carve out an area around the Great Lakes and present this nation state idea, really, of like, this will be ours. It seems, I don't know how you parse this, that it's hard for me to imagine ways to fight nationalist colonialization with something other than your own I mean, this is the trap that you're saying your book sets up, is you fall into the trap of building the thing you're trying to fight against in order to just say, well, ours will just be a little better for me. Because plenty of the Palestinians would hear what you say and say, well, I get it, but it'll be better the next day. At least the Palestinians will rule over me because, the Zionists are so terrible. So is she telling me not to fight for this thing because it's not perfect? Like, how do you respond to that?
The short-lived history of the Oslo Accords,
Yeah.
right? What happened after the Oslo Accords? Like people were like somehow convinced that there was going to be soon a Palestinian state and the Palestinian Authority was set up. And what did the Palestinian Authority do, right? What do Palestinians think about the Palestinian
Yeah.
Authority, right? It's 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 a terror machine,
Yeah.
right? It is a stealing, denigrating terror machine. That's what
Yeah.
the Palestinian Authority is. What do they imagine a Palestinian state will be like?
Yeah.
Like, so I think that uh, I can understand, someone once said to me when I was critiquing the Hawaiian sovereignty struggle,
Mm.
right? That we want, territorial sovereignty and saying like, can I tell you what happened in India? Can I tell you what happened when, people won that battle? What happened to most people who weren't part of the ruling elite that controlled the Indian nation state? And someone responded to me saying, like, well, yeah, that's fine, but at least you have your own nation state. And I was like, wow, like you actually think that India is mine, right? And
Yeah.
that's the kind of racialized imagination, it's the nationalist imagination, and there's no ability to see the reality on the ground, which is that a small ruling strata of capitalists and people who define themselves as the quintessential members of the Indian nation, which is today Hindus,
Mm.
right? And if you're not a Hindu, you're not really a member of the nation. And we're going to try and strip Muslims and Christians and Sikhs of their citizenship and set up concentration camps to put them in. That's all part and parcel of what comes with national sovereignty, right?
Mm.
We cannot just simply say, well, we don't know that because we have the proof of,
Yeah.
which nation state in the world is actually not something that we would want to fight against,
Yeah.
right?
Well,
So,
yeah, sorry, go.
no, 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 sorry, go ahead.
No, 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 it's good. There's two questions. Like, I guess I'm tempted to wonder. Well, okay, I think there's a history lesson that I need here because I have this idea in my head. Really important distinction that I think I missed and I glossed over is you said nationalist anti-colonial movements, right? Which implies that there were non-nationalists, maybe more internationalism. I'm thinking of, because I've also been so deep in the history of the post-World War II movements, even in Palestine, of like the PFLP and leftist movements. I brought up Ghassan Kanafani in one of my debates, and I was just filled with Zionists in my inbox telling me what a terrorist he was. Anyway, but these were leftist movements that, correct me if I'm wrong, really would have agreed with you, and they really worried about the nationalist thing. These were Marxists and anti-capitalists who were very much opposed to Zionism as a function of global imperialism. And then just one more, because I think that actually to think of a slogan that actually captures it, I remember in the after October 7th, I think it was Norman Finkelstein. He had the same thought as I had. He was at some rally where people were chanting from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, and he was trying to correct them and give them a little bit of an edit where he said from the river to the sea, Palestinians will be free, which I
Hmm.
think echoes kind of what the same fear that you're saying of like this should be about people and
Mhm.
freedom rather than these abstract notions of whatever the hell Palestine or Israel or Russia or any of these things are. So my question is in that history lesson is, did it have to be this way that you can't think of an example and I can't think of an example of a nation state that isn't something we ought to fight against? I agree with you. But did it have to be that way? Is it just that they never let the good guys win? Because everyone I mentioned there of the leftist, non-nationalist, anti-imperialist movements are always crushed, always thwarted, and slandered as, I don't know,
Well,
utopianism or something.
I think that we didn't have to live in the world that we live in,
Yeah,
right?
I love
And we
that. Yeah.
we came to live in the world that we live in because of the losses that people who fought for something better and something more endured, right? One of the biggest losses was people's co-optation into the category of nation, right? The idea of the nation has always been a ruling class notion, right? People, for instance, during the English Civil War of the 17th century, fought for something much bigger, right? These peasants who were, suffering the enclosure of their common lands, right? This is also the period, of the consolidation of the transatlantic slave trade. This is also the period of the imperial expansion and colonization of the Americas, right, and the Pacific and the Caribbean, and then eventually, also Asia and Africa. And the people in the 17th century said, we are fighting against slavery. We are fighting against colonialism. We are fighting against capital. We want our land back. And we want to be in control of our own labor, our life energy. And a major way in which they were co-opted into supporting the British Empire, rather than supporting the anti-slavery, anti-colonial movements that they were a part of, was the idea that they were now Englishmen. Right? So bringing them into the category of we are Englishmen, and therefore we need to fight for ourselves. And those people who are being enslaved and those people who are being colonized in Ireland or in the Americas, well, they can fight for themselves. It's total classic divide and rule strategy. So nationhood has been from the beginning a strategy of division, right? And co-optation. The national liberation movements of the 19th century, 20th century, I would argue in the book Home Rule, are also major mechanisms of co-optation. People were fighting for something much, much more, right? And there was a lot of global solidarity in those movements. They weren't only about, I'm an Indian and I'm going to fight for my rights. And people had very different ideas. Some people wanted equality amongst all people on the planet. They didn't want, national sovereignty. They didn't see that as a solution because they could recognize already that, in most colonized societies, people had an lived experience of rulers.
Yeah.
They know what especially in, India, my God, right? Like, it's not like prior to the British, there was peace and freedom and everyone had land, right? Like, you had these major landlords and kings and whatever, emperors. So people understood that they didn't want just to replicate that system. So nationhood, the fight for national sovereignty, is at the end of the day an absolute co-optation and containment of liberation struggles, right?
Yeah. So in some, just to really get, it feels like science fiction, which is the problem. I'm trying to come up with another, but it doesn't feel within this world, which is just how much my brain has been co-opted into the map that I'm looking at that's, already drawn, is the enclosure movement is a great way to talk about it. I would love to learn more about it. But in your ideal world, you wish there was pockets of this earth that was fighting to free the land, right? To be this is what is your vision of it? If it's not to fight for sovereignty, it's to fight. I mean, I did a couple shows on anarchy, so I know the lingo and I agree with it. But what is that, to undo the enclosures? For people who don't know about the enclosures, it feels like such a foreign concept. To be land was not territory at one point, and then it all became territorialized land. Is this what you're hoping for, to free the land back to?
Yeah. I mean, it would. Yeah, it's interesting to think of it as a deterritorialization project, right? An unnationalizing project. And I think maybe the best way to put it is I'm currently working on a book with Bridget Anderson and Cynthia Wright, an edited volume. And we talk about the need for undivision, right? The great undivide. We need to undivide ourselves, right?
Yeah.
That means not imagining ourselves as members of races and nations and genders and all of the different ways that we parcel ourselves off from one another, which is not to say that we all have to be the same, but to acknowledge and to recognize and to undo our association with categories that were imposed upon us by people who wanted to contain our demands for freedom, right? So we need to undivide and we need to deterritorialize, right? The world in 2025, not the world in 25, it's not the world in 1525, it's not the world in 1825. We cannot imagine a society as anything other than a planetary society at this point. We live in a shared society. We don't, I know I don't live in an American society, and others live in a Spanish society or a German society or a Chinese society. We live in a society which includes all of us. So if we took seriously the demand for land back, which is a major demand in North America, for example, for decolonization, and took that seriously and literally took it to mean land and not national territory. If we then that we are talking about a planetary land back movement, right? We need to be able to live outside of capitalist markets of food, of shelter, of medicine, of we need, and in order to do that, we need land. We need the ability to control land in the sense that we need to be able to keep people who want to be rulers. We need to end the possibility that anyone can rule over us.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's what true self-determination means, is no rulers.
Yeah.
So I do think it is an anarchist project. It is which anarchy literally means the absence of rulers. That's literally what anarchy means.
Yeah.
Right.
I guess it. How do you respond to people who think it just all sounds a little too distant and utopian? The stuff you said, it sounds like so basic and so like, oh, we need to find each other in the land and get rid of all these rulers. But everyone's like, there's a fucking genocide in Gaza happening right now. And like the world is on fire. And like, I don't know, we just need all this madness to stop. In some abstractly, I wanted to ask you what needs to end first, the idea of the nation or capitalism, because they seem so linked. But that's an abstract question. So it's like, I'm hearing in my voice, like, I love everything you're saying, and I agree with it on paper, but I'm like, we're all exhausted and we need this shit to stop. And whatever gets it to stop, I don't know. Or are we just destined for World War III, and then that's when we'll have that conversation when people like you will finally have the mic being like, hey, ready to listen now? Do you see how that went? Because it feels like you've got the mic on my show, but I want you to have a bigger mic. I don't know.
Well, I hope it doesn't take World War III for us to come to our senses. And when you say we're living in a world of genocides and, on fire, there is no better time to learn the lesson that national sovereignty is not the solution to either global capitalism or to efforts of people to colonize our land and expropriate our labor, right? This is, if not now, when, right? And what that means practically on the ground, I'm not saying that I'm not going to stay out of the 2026 US elections, or I'm not going to fight Trump and try and get some other, person who rules the United States who isn't, an utterly depraved fascist, right? But it's with the recognition that the only reason that I would, for example, vote for a Democrat over Trump himself, or well, against a fascist candidate, is not to say that I think that then everything will be fine. It's that there'll just be a little bit more room to maneuver, right? Like we're literally like here, life in the United States today is even, you know, relatively privileged people like myself are hatching escape plans. Like, how do we get out of here? Where are we going to go? And that's where citizenship comes in.
Yeah.
Where, who, you, I don't have any right to go anywhere else in the world other than where I hold citizenship,
Yeah. Well,
right?
I left. I'm in Spain, which you mentioned,
Yes.
and I'm actually soon going to Germany. And then, oddly, the only one with my citizenship and my last name, I could go to Israel, I suppose, but that's out of the question. They would let me in on day one, although now they know my work, they wouldn't. But no, I've been dealing with these borders and the
Yeah.
bureaucracy and everything. But on that note, I mean, I get some of my haters who know where I live call me a colonizer and tell me, you know what I mean? Like, I guess I also want you to address the absurdities of nationalism become very apparent right away, as well as indigenous claims. I mean, the Israel-Palestine thing is famous when everyone's like, when do we start the clock? This is all kind of insane. Like, does my
Yeah.
DNA have any of this? And everyone kind of knows it. They just
Yeah.
fail to have the imagination like you do to really strive for something a little bit more revolutionary and better. There's one anecdote, then I'll let you respond because I think it's great. I think I've quoted this guy 3 times now. He was a taxi driver in Nepal when I was in his cab before they've had this really exciting Gen Z revolution, and they used to have a monarchy in living memory, and he says, yeah, we used to have one king, now we have 700, because he had a senate. Obviously, that anger was shared amongst the people, and they took care of that. But to your point, exactly there. Actually, this is a good one to ask you because I think that's a really exciting piece of news. But you might not be as excited because you're like, what are the ideas in the Gen Z revolution, which also, by the way, is happening in Kenya and is
Yeah.
interestingly connecting and spreading through social media around the developing world.
And happened
It
in
does
Bangladesh and happened in
Bangladesh too.
Lanka.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and Uganda, and it has the Gen Z label, at
Yeah.
least in Kenya. I think that's spreading. So good on Gen Z. They get shit on a lot as a generation, but there's something brewing there, and it does feel a little
Yeah.
anti-capitalist, as it were. Is
Yeah.
that something that you're interested in? I gave you a lot to respond to there, but yeah.
No, I mean, I think that the only thing to do right now, which is the only thing that has ever worked, is to organize movements that are going
Hmm.
to fight for what we actually want. Right? Like, and
That's the hard part, knowing what we
that's
actually
that
want.
that
Yeah.
is the hardest part because organizing means talking to people, and it often means convincing them that many of the ways that they understand themselves or that I understand myself uh, is um, is part of how I'm being kept down,
Hmm.
right? And so it's the hard work of actually talking to people and bringing them into movements and that together then continuously keep changing. But if we don't have a broader political horizon to work towards and walk towards, other than just get rid of this ruler or put a new ruler in place, as good as much better as they may be, then what we're failing to acknowledge is that the nation state is actually a structure of ruling over us in the name of us, which is even more nefarious than the empires were,
Hmm.
right? There's something really nefarious about being told that you yourself rule when you know in your everyday lives, like nothing could be further from the truth, right? That you have very little say about what happens in this national space that you live in,
Yeah.
right? And that's, that brings us back to anti-immigrant politics, right? Uh, Migrants are an absolute necessity for every nation state because they are always the reason that the national project continues to fail to live up to its promises, right? Like, if only we could get rid of the foreigners, right? If only we could get rid of these migrants, then, Americans would have jobs. If only we could get rid of Chinese capital, then, America would be strong. If, which is part of the kind of neocolonialism thesis, which I have a problem with, right? Is that there's a problem. It's always foreigners. It's so the anti-colonial struggle lives on in every nationalist movement, right? All nationalists, whether they have a sovereign state or not, feel colonized today, right?
Yeah.
People in France, right? Like white French people literally say they're being colonized by migrants, right? Hindu fascists in India literally talk about being colonized by Muslims,
Yeah.
right? So it's like so if we don't recognize that anti-colonialism is doing a lot of the work of the people in power today, and we somehow think that these are our movements, we are really failing to see how the world is actually structured,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
anti-colonialism is the rhetoric because they need someone to blame, and the classic anti-colonial target is foreigners, right? Once we get rid of the foreigners, then the nation will be free, right?
Yeah.
That is still ongoing today in every nation state, in every nationalist struggle, right? And anti-migrant politics, if we cannot account or build a world in which people can move, talk about going against human nature, right? Mobility is part of human nature. Humans move, right? Stasis is literally death. People move. They move to things that are better or safer or more adventurous or more exciting, or where their loved ones are, or where the people they're fleeing from are not, whatever. People move. People have always moved.
Yeah.
If we can't account for a political way of organizing human life that allows people to move and to do so with all of the same rights and privileges and entitlements and welcoming and home and love as everyone else, that is a world of violence.
Yeah.
Right? We are always going to live in an incredibly violent world if we cannot account for that. This world cannot account for that.
Yeah.
So this world has got to change.
Yeah. That was great. Yeah. No, that was great. In simple terms, you're looking for a post-colonial rather than anti-colonial, post-colonial anti-nationalism effort, which seems imaginable, but also difficult to put into practice.
Yeah. I would put it a bit differently. Like I always talk about it in the forms of we need a planetary commons.
Yeah.
We need a commons, right? And what the commons is that nation states are not is there is no private property in a commons, and there is no citizenship in a commons.
Yeah.
There are no sovereigns in the commons, right?
Yeah.
You enter the commons through your life energy, right? You need to live. Here is land, live, right? You get to move, right? The commons is a planetary level of society, right? It's the commons. It's all of ours. And it's not just all of ours as human beings. It's all of ours, right? So it's all
sounds really nice.
It sounds nice, right? But again, I always go back to the enormous centuries-long struggle against slavery, right? Today, slavery has largely been rendered illegitimate, right? For the vast majority of people in the world would shudder at the thought of supporting another system of slavery, right? Let's go capture these people, enslave them, and make them go and clear the jungle for us, right? Like most people would say, no, 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 I don't support that. That's not inevitable, or that took organizing and struggle and some vision that we could live in a world without slavery, which was an enormous vision, right? The
Yeah.
wealthiest and most powerful people on the planet gained their power and wealth through slavery. To end that system, that's what we're talking about. We need to end this system, right? We need to build a kind of, movement that the abolitionists built, the slavery
Yeah.
abolitionists built, right?
Yeah. Well, what do you see then in the short term, I guess, with all of these movements? I mean, I think these are really important critiques. And I guess the thing that you said that worries me the most is the possibility that these anti-colonialist conversations and efforts are really just being co-opted by people who, will let you form your own sovereign nation as long as you kind of do it in the fashion that allows all the money flows to remain,
Yeah.
uninhabited or uninhibited. And for all of us people, like you're saying, to remain divided and not find each other and be like, you know what, I think we actually deserve a little more as conscious creatures than what all of this shit is giving us.
So there are people today who are fighting for that world, right? And I would say that at the forefront of that battle, right, just as the forefront of the slavery abolitionist battle were slaves, the forefront of the battle today of the great undivision, in which the central division is between citizens and migrants, are people who are crossing borders without state permission, right? Those people who have been turned into migrants. They're literally saying, I need to live, and I am willing to disobey whatever laws this system has erected to keep me down and keep me, much more susceptible to a premature death. And I'm going to move. And people are moving. And they may not all imagine like, oh, I'm part of a political movement, but they are enacting what that movement is calling for, right? Which is freedom of movement is a major plank of that struggle. So it's to support people, right? It's to fight against deportations. It's to say there is nothing legitimate about the state deporting people, right? We need to stop differentiating ourselves from migrants. We need to actually call into question our citizenship rights, right? So I think that there are very concrete things that are happening. I'm part of No Borders movements. I protest ICE, operations in Hawaii every week. We're trying to put together a rapid response system that that acts in solidarity with people who are being deported, not in the name of citizens acting in solidarity with migrants, but like people together working against this system of citizenship and immigration controls, right? So there's real things that we can be doing to build those movements, and I think that a lot of people are. And the movements that I'm most connected to and part of are no borders movements. Like literally just say, you know, these are illegitimate. I don't accept the state's right or authority to tell people when and if they can move.
Yeah. And then just to wrap it up on Palestine, since that's been on my mind and obviously everyone's mind, if they get this, like in your ideal world, if you could, confer with everyone leading their movements from Hamas to everyone else, what would you be hoping they were pushing for? Is it literally just like, um, you know, free this land for us? Like, it just seems like still like how do we fight these things in the face of such violence without falling into the traps that you've identified that are there?
Yeah, I think that, I know that this is possibly going to sound really trite and naive, but I think that if all of us fight for all of this for all of us, that is what is going to get us out of this mess, right? I honestly do not think that continuing to talk about a Palestinian sovereignty as the solution is actually going to help actual Palestinians, right? I think it's just going to um, perpetuate the belief that the whole world should be divided up into nation states, that somehow there's some kind of legitimacy about an Israeli nation state, and all we need to do is tag on a Palestinian nation state beside it, and therefore everything will be fine. It makes absolutely no sense. There will be no peace in that context, right? The only peace will be a peace in which there's no rulers and in which all the land is all of ours, right? And that Palestinians can have land as can everyone else, right? It's going to come down to that, I think.
Wow. Yeah, it's a beautiful way to end it, and it's a beautiful vision. I mean, I think I'm with you. I'm on board. let's let's hope that we can get there. It's really
Thank you.
fun.
I liked it too. Thank you.
Cool. All right. Take care. So the idea that I maybe kind of pushed into Nandita's mind a little bit there, which I was quite happy to do, was maybe the philosophical one about, decolonizing our very notions of freedom itself. I absolutely love that, of course. It might be a topic for a solo essay in the future, since it's so crucial to the thinking I do about what freedom really means and existential freedom. And of course, Eric Fromm, who I reference all the time, and his escape from freedom. I think it runs right into the Hobbesian conception of freedom, which I talk about at the beginning of those anarchy episodes that I mentioned. And Hobbes feared that humans cannot nor should be really free in that sense. They should invent leviathans in order to contain our freedom and direct our freedom. And what Sharma and really I would contend is that the quest of humanity is to shed all forms of leviathans, and certainly to conceive of freedom as something which stands in complete contrast to the idea of the nation state, which I think, again, we've come to take for granted as kind of inevitable or natural or maybe even good. And that's not to say that all nations are equal, although the nation state idea might be an unfree idea. There might be nations which attempt to define themselves in more or less free ways, I suppose. Although I think the freest conception of the self might be one where the nation really is fully dissolved. So the danger, of course, as she said, is that if a liberation struggle becomes a nationalist liberation struggle, it's simply going to end up giving birth to yet another oppressive state full of its exclusionary and discriminatory practices. And then at that point, what was the liberation effort really for? So if you answer that, thinking about Palestine, when you hear this critique, by insisting or deciding that it just has to be some sort of interim step that is necessary, to simply expel or conquer more evil forces, get your political sovereignty first. I hear you loud and clear, and I'm certainly your ally and rooting for you, but let's not forget to have that next conversation at some point, because we all do deserve better. So if you're wondering how I'm feeling about Palestinian state recognition, it's probably more in that shrug category, right? Of course, I want direct action. I want sanctions. I want this to end. You heard me voicing my frustration there. I'm certainly on the record as being in favor of a one state, although she would say get rid of the word state in that. But sure, equality for everybody, right? What could be better than that? But if states are bad, I'll take one rather than two, right? As just maybe a step towards something. But I won't forget this conversation, and I won't forget, I think, the really true advice that Nandita has, as maybe flimsy as it and fanciful as it can sound. And then, okay, for the members also, I will be there here on Sunday to talk to you. But I had a little spillover. Nandita and I kept talking for another 15-ish minutes or so, just sort of bantering after we finished the formal recording, and I thought it was really good. So I'm just going to upload that too and make that for members only. I guess I'll do that from time to time. For the non-members, there's nothing like earth-shattering in it. I try to put the really good stuff, but there's some good stuff in there to pull as well. So I'll put that out. For the members, I'll see you on Sunday. And then for everyone else, I'll see you in the next video. My next one is actually with Professor Michael Sawyer from Pittsburgh, who's really a scholar who does a lot of incredible work, but a big focus on Malcolm X. And we're going to be talking a lot about Malcolm X and similar things of this, including his visit to Gaza in 1965, which I think I actually recently learned. I knew he had done this trek from doing the Hajj in Mecca all the way through Africa. I didn't know he went on the next one a year before he died or was killed. He went to Gaza, and he ended up writing an article for an Egyptian newspaper called Zionist Logic, which tied Zionism directly to dollarization and global imperialism led by American imperialist forces. And I have no doubt that writing that and thinking that in such a way was a large contributor in getting him killed. So we're going to be talking about Malcolm X in a really important way. So I'll see you for that next one, and see you all next time. Thanks.